Another one I would mention is more coordination in general. I already mentioned this in this context, but it's become well known that with that accountable care organizations actually work pretty well, and they really do reduce costs. Managed care helps, and this coordination of care among multiple providers, a team of physicians and therapists and pharmacists and so on working together, again focused on these particular groups, can make a big difference. The problem today is they're not well connected. That is everything from simple things like scheduling and transportation to the more complex integration of medical information about patients that can really make a difference. The third one I would mention is integration of clinical and financial data. Today, it's still the case that you often, when we as patients, when we try to figure out how much something costs, we can't get a decent answer. And you go to, if you can't get an answer, you also learn how big the differences are between them. Hospitals themselves often don't know how much something costs, and they often can't make the trade-offs. If I keep this person in the hospital one day longer, maybe I can avoid a very costly readmission. But I don't really know that. Often the tools don't exist for that. The clinical data may be available, but the financial data is in a completely different place. That kind of integration can make a huge difference in better understanding and reducing costs and improving care at the same time.
Boy, I'm glad I'm going second, because I'm sure I would run out of ideas if I was further down the table here. I'll try to bring a little bit of the IT investor's perspective to this question, right? Because as I mentioned, kind of that's where I personally feel, what's most that intersection of healthcare and IT is what's most interesting to me, and quite frankly, where I see tremendous room for continued innovation. So one way to look at this question is to look at the numbers, right? So what happened to healthcare financing in 2012? So 2012, 134 digital health companies raised at least $2 million or more. That's a pretty impressive number if you think about it, and that it's been going up actually, just pointing to the kind of trend that I think we're all going to be speaking to, and what we're all kind of excited about on the panel tonight. Within that, the kind of biggest buckets were personal health tools and health tracking, consumer engagement, there were EMRs, EHRs, and finally there was hospital administration, kind of enabling that to be more efficient. In terms of areas that I personally am more excited about, I'd say one is certainly the whole quantified self movement, right? We're all walking around today with these iPhones and smartphones in our pocket as incredibly powerful computing platforms that provide an array of sensors to be able to measure a lot about our daily activities. And there are companies like Fitbit and Basis that are coming out with kind of wearable computing devices that can actually measure things like heartbeat and perspiration and calories burned and how you sleep during the day. So I think that whole notion of a consumer, whether through active engagement, so there are other devices like the Happy Fork, where you take this fork and you eat stuff and it tells you how much calories are in whatever you're putting it in. But there's active and there's passive devices. But I think what it does is it opens up this vast amount of data, right, around a person's everyday activity. And what you can do with the data, I think we're going to get to big data and its implications later in the panel, is pretty incredible. And it's the first time that you can collect this at this kind of a ubiquitous scale. Secondly, I'd say the move to EMR and EHR, I think is certainly something that the entire venture industry is looking to. I think it's happening at a slower pace than people predicted 10 years ago. But the benefits, both from a cost and efficiency perspective, are pretty self-evident. And then finally, I'd say, generically, I like businesses that can help reduce the friction in the doctor-patient interaction. And that could be as simple as companies like ZocDoc that help make it so simple to schedule an appointment. I'm still kind of baffled, right? As a consumer, if you have to schedule an appointment with your doctor, you have to sort of make all these deliberate things, calling and scheduling and putting in your calendar, and canceling is another headache. And by the way, it's really inefficient for the physician because then they lose their slot and oftentimes can't rebook. That is just so, 1900s in some sense. And then kind of related to that, I think, as you alluded to, Marcus, kind of this whole notion of transparency and costs. If I can shop for auto insurance online, why can't I shop for health insurance online as an individual or as a small business, right? If I want to get a procedure done, and why can't I get some transparency into real costs? Why is it that, at least in my experience, a lot of consumers don't even know what the bill's going to be until 3 weeks after their appointment they get some sort of reconciled statement from the administrative assistant at the physician's office about what their out-of-pocket expense is really going to be. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there as well in terms of reducing the friction in the doctor-patient relationship by leveraging technology and digitization.
Thank you. I'd like to echo some of what Mark has said. I think here we should really follow Willie Sutton's rule, follow the money, because there are 2.3 or $2.8 trillion spent on healthcare. It's consumed by 75% of that money is consumed by the patients that have one or more chronic disease, a handful of chronic diseases: diabetes, hypertension, ischemic heart disease, heart failure. That accounts for 81% of hospital admissions, for 91% of all drugs prescribed, and 76% of all doctor's visits. That's the statistics. So, that's where the money is being consumed. So the future, in my opinion, and I'm looking at a large healthcare system that I work for, but I'm also looking at the changes that I see coming up as a result of the Affordable Care Act, where small groups will have to become large groups in order to compete successfully for the healthcare dollar. And what that means is that it's going to be a networked healthcare system. So the ability to leverage specialists in a healthcare system, the ability to have remote consultation, have more efficient use of a doctor's time is going to be critical and is already happening through telehealth. The VA has made an incredible investment in telehealth, going so far as to say that by 2015, 15% of all patient encounters of the 6 million people that we see will have to have been touched by telehealth in some way. That means tremendous investment in remote imaging, in remote consultation devices, in web-based consultation platforms, and so I think that's a big avenue for growth. I also think that patients are going to have to take more responsibility for behavior change and promoting better health. And so you see a lot of apps, a lot of mobile apps, a lot of web-based apps that are coming on board that large organizations would certainly want to have if they can, what they call, shift the curve to the right of when a patient gets disease or when they get a serious illness. And if you can do that, you can save a lot of money. So the idea of devices that promote behavior change and positive health outcomes. And finally, the amount of data. I agree with the panelists about the amount of data that's coming up, and it's like much of the internet, it's like drinking from a fire hose unless you have, if you have some logic to it. And so applications that make better use of data for large organizations or for smaller organizations looking to become large are something that I think is a growth industry for the future.
Thanks. From El Camino Hospital's perspective, and to build on, and agreeing with my fellow panelists out here, to build on what they have said, the hospital is looking at 3 different buckets. One, it is looking at analytics of data, and the analytics of data is looking at it from the retroactive data, proactive data, and big data management. So retroactive, they want to basically get caught up and understand what has happened. They're looking to have future predictive aspects built in. And we all know that population health, big data management is going to be critical for us to make predictions going forward. The second bucket that they're focusing on is risk management and mitigation, and empowering the patient and enrolling the patient in working with them to ensure that happens. That's a given. It has to be a team approach, and some of my fellow panelists did mention that we have to get the patient more involved. But we all know that you send your 80-year-old grandmother home, she falls, she comes back, and then the costs skyrockets, and there's a spiral to that. So just making sure that those facets are taken care of. And then the third thing is, and that's a given, we're seeing that is the whole consumerization of IT. So the trend of bring your own device, and is going to be, you'll see more of that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I agree with pretty much everything that the panelists have said. I'll add some slightly different points of view on some of the things, in particular on the one of the things we dealt with at HealthCare Partners is we considered ourselves a accountable care organization before there was such a thing as an accountable care organization. We are a managed care medical group providing services to the Medicare. So we are a Medicare Advantage. About 80% of our patients were Medicare Advantage, which means that they were elderly and needed to be serviced. So we looked at a lot of how do we assist and provide better care for them. We looked at deploying devices in the patient home to help with the monitoring. We had partnerships with both Intel and Cisco where they had devices that sat in the patient home that had both video as well as monitoring capability so that we can try to collect the data from the patient directly. We were, of course, challenged with some of our interoperability issues and some other issues, but those were pilot programs. We're trying to really engage the patient more. And we see that much more. As Gaurav said, there are many more mobile devices with a lot of data. That's going to continue to proliferate. And the challenge is going to be for us to actually consume that data, to be able to do analysis and then eventually predictive modeling, which is what many of the providers are looking at is how do I take all this wonderful data, analyze it, and predict the outcomes of a procedure, the outcomes of the care that we're providing, give the patient the best efficacy. And I think lastly, or secondly, that data explosion goes not only for the data that we are collecting about the patient, but just all the things that are out there on the medical journals. And many of the providers that I've dealt with have not necessarily complained, but have noted that the amount of medical knowledge in the past 5 years far outstrips the amount of medical knowledge prior to that. So now we need to be able to organize that data and give it to the providers when they need it, because there's just too much out there, and they need to be able to find the information that they need for the patient down to very specific disease states, hopefully with the latest research with proven evidence base. And there's just too much for them to read now. They'd be reading every day for the rest of their lives just to catch up. And to help them facilitate just caring for their patients, what I've seen a lot as I'm working with these providers and actually providing the care, and they're doing their EHRs and the EMRs, and many of them are complaining and concerned about, well, they've agreed that the EMR gives them better data, gives them better quality of information, it has slowed them down. And what many of them have said is, give me back my phone where I can transcribe my notes, but do that in a way that I can then get the data out of it. So natural language processing in conjunction with voice recognition, I think is something that's going to be coming down the pipe. We see several organizations that are pushing that way, trying to integrate it into the EMR to facilitate the capturing of that information by the physician as they want to dictate it, but also being able to collect data for analysis.
Okay, that was a lot. Did we all get that? So, we're also seeing a shift in the health sector to seamless and rapid provisioning of healthcare. We're talking, and many of these topics were mentioned by our panelists about electronic health records, mobility, increased analytics. I guess so. Now the first question would be for the healthcare practitioner, someone on the practice side, which is how are you collecting data? I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. I mean, the VA's medical record has been around since 1999, and the database is second only in size to the IRS database. All of Austin, Texas has a database, as far as I know, and I've been there. So, this is everything that is done in VA is recorded and then sucked out and shipped to Austin nightly. Everything that happened today down the street in Palo Alto is transmitted to Austin every day. And what happens to that data? So there's a huge repository of research data. It becomes research data, in part, accessible to a cohort of health scientists who exist all over the country, a big center here at Stanford, for health outcome research. Some people in the audience who I know are involved in this as well. And those researchers query the database and try to glean best practices and future clinical algorithms that physicians may use. And so there's an algorithm that exists for hypertension treatment as part of the medical record here at Palo Alto, which is being tested among selected providers. And there's other algorithms for major clinical diagnoses, also either incorporated in pilot projects or as part of the next generation medical record. So that's certainly an area that people are looking at beyond simply notation of what happened in a medical record. Then that information is also queryable to people like myself who are interested, for example, in our 1 million patients who had diabetic retinopathy screening. What % of them had retinopathy? What % of them have vision-threatening eye disease, et cetera? Where do those people live? Are they being taken care of? When was their last appointment? Right now, that data requires a long process in order to access, basically signing your firstborn away in order to be part of that. And so it's not available to the average clinician, and that's where the healthcare is going. So the Undersecretary of Health has talked about transactional interactions of the provider with a patient, critical transactional interactions, which basically say, for this provider, can he get access to for this patient, being taken care of by a healthcare provider, can he or she get access to the kind of information which will improve the clinical outcome of that patient? So can you get the history of blood pressures very easily? Can you graph that? Can you understand what medications that patient has been on as you see them in your office? And so the future of healthcare is being able to narrow down these large databases so that within this region that stretches from Palo Alto to Sonora to Monterey to San Francisco, that comprises the Vision 21, can you acquire the kind of information that will actually change the outcome of the patient? So that's an important way that information is being used. And it's also being used as predictive models. So one piece of software, again developed by healthcare researchers within VA, but if they saw an outside product that did the same thing or better, they would jump at it. This product that was developed within VA predicts the rate of hospitalization and death in a patient population that is being taken care of in the primary care clinic. Very powerful if you want to intervene to decrease hospitalizations and death among patients who are right now just going about their business, having doctor's appointments every few months. So, I think
so
that's a good start.
Just to ask more about the predictive modeling.
Yes.
So with that, can you play sort of like all the different what-if kind of scenarios, or do you take all the information from that primary care clinic and it generates a set of answers?
Well, it's very new. Literally, this was just published and incorporated as a pilot project in one hospital at the end of the year, end of 2012. So it's the kind of thing that's a culmination of many different health economists and health modeling that allowed this to happen. But think how it's very powerful because you have all this data and you have accessibility to actually drill down to the individual patient level. And so it's the kind of thing that right now is what is anticipated is to bring this to the regional level. So right now it's the kind of thing that can be done as a group but not as an individual level to really have a positive impact on care. But the plan is to be able to have it regionalized and to incorporate that into the system. Similar software is one that was also instituted within the past 2 years in all the cardiac care cath labs within VA. So if you walk into any of the 173 hospitals that are in VA, those that are doing cardiac catheterization have a standardized piece of software that during the testing will incorporate all the parameters of that patient's illness and disability in terms of percent vessels blocked, etc. Will look at the outcomes of those cardiac catheterizations and be analyzed by a group in Washington, D.C. to say, are there some sites that are falling out in terms of complications? Can we say anything about death rates or hospitalization rates based on cardiac catheterization within X number of days or weeks from the time that they had it? Things like that. So predictive models, standardization. So the future of healthcare in large organizations is standardizing the different healthcare systems, because although we do have the same computerized medical record, there are regional and local variations. And so when somebody says that they had a medical encounter, if it's not coded in the same way at all hospitals, then it won't be able to be incorporated in the database as a significant factor. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. So there's a lot going on, and it is being used for quality control. You know, when they see death rates or infection rates that are above a certain level, if it hasn't been noted on the local level, it's the kind of thing that there are regional oversights. We have a regional information technology group, we have local information technology groups, and we have a national information technology group. So there's a lot going on, but for the individual provider, that's the future, and that's really what people are looking for.
Marcus.
And maybe if I can add to it another interesting point of view, and that's government regulations. As you probably know, with the HITECH Act first, and then the ACA, the HealthCare reform, there are a number of programs that CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, has instituted in order to hold hospitals more accountable. There's more reporting on the kinds of what's called meaningful use, the kinds of uses in hospitals of electronic medical records. There's something called value-based purchasing, where Medicare reimbursement now depends on how well you're doing in your hospital, and hospitals have to report on a fairly large number of measures on how well they're doing. Whether it's falls in the hospitals, infections acquired in the hospitals, readmissions, and so on. For readmissions specifically, is a program where, again, for readmission within 30 days, there are penalties or not reimbursement based on that. SOX has a line of business called Midas Plus. It's probably the largest comparative database we're maintaining in the U.S. About 1,700 hospitals have that software and collecting about 3,000 measures. Just the scale, so it's not just a few things. I was pretty surprised when I first heard this. So hospitals are reporting on about 3,000 measures every month. These measures go to CMS. They're all published on a website that all of us can go to and look up how well hospitals are doing. Hospitals themselves use it, first of all, for their quality improvements internally. So there is one question always, how are we doing with our, falls and infections and so on, and where should we improve? There's the comparative. We can help hospitals compare, and I think there's more opportunity there in collecting more data. And as I said earlier, we're primarily focusing on the clinical data. Adding the financial data can make a big difference, so hospitals can understand where improvements have the biggest bang for the buck. Then, of course, there is the reporting that I mentioned that is very relevant. And I think, again, from what I said earlier about this integration of financial and clinical data, there's a lot of opportunity. We also have been working on readmission prediction. The next thing after predictive modeling is prescriptive analytics, where you not only find that there's a problem, but you can even tell the physician what to do about it, because identifying what the probable cause is. There's still a lot of work to be done in this area, but I think there's a lot of potential to support physicians in their work.
Nandini, you
Yes.
seem eager to get in on this.
No, I just wanted to say that I think it's very exciting. At El Camino Hospital, they have concentric circles of influence where data is being manipulated, gathered, utilized. So, for example, they have a very broad program looking at the two silos of the business analytics and the clinical analytics, and obviously to integrate it. Secondly, what they're doing is that they are centralizing data from hundreds of solution vendors. So centralizing it and trying to see how they can best manipulate that information. And then the last facet is something like you said about in the context of the VA hospital. There's a Health and Vascular Institute where they are creating systems by which they can have hundreds of pieces of information about the health of the heart. So I think it's very exciting that at different phases you're seeing a multi-year, multi-phase program put together in different silos, but at the end of the day, the idea would be to cross function and utilize it in a meaningful way for a positive outcome.
I think that's one of the challenges that I've heard in just the 20 minutes or whatever that we've been speaking, that utilizing data cross-functionally. So either through, from one group to another, from one healthcare group organization to another healthcare organization, or from, financial and clinical. What's being done to help facilitate that sharing and interoperability and sort of break down these data silos? Royce?
What's being done? Well,
or what should be done?
what should be done? I think realistically what's happening in many of the organizations, they're having enough problems just gathering their internal information. Well, all these, VA is a great example of a lot of data. Even within the VA, and definitely within some of the other health systems, while they're electronifying much of their information in the EHR, there's a boatload of other information that is not being captured discreetly. That information is vital in providing accurate patient care, and that's one of our major challenges. Now, once they can figure out how to do that internally, sharing that across other organizations has been a challenge and will be a challenge as we go into the next century. And while meaningful use and the ARRA and the High Tech Act were designed to eventually, I think, help bridge that gap and hopefully enable organizations to share information, it's relatively small right now what they're supposed to do, are required to do, right, with the transition of cares, what data they're actually going to give, and how do we actually do that. And I think we're struggling with that as healthcare organizers, particularly not only how do I communicate with a competitor sometimes, right? So it's maybe competitive information. I don't want to, from one hospital to the other hospital, they don't want to necessarily refer information over there. Same thing with the providers. Some of the smaller providers don't want to share some of this clinical information with others. But yet, that's how we're going to improve patient care. So until government has stepped in, that was relatively non-existent. There was some, definitely within specific systems, VA, St. Joseph's, Palo Alto, or the UCs that were sharing data. But
if you look at the deployment of IT in hospitals, it's like PC in the 70s. Every hospital has its own operating system, in some fashion. And in part, this is because the deployment of IT is relatively recent in hospitals compared to the financial industry or many others. Healthcare is way behind, and we're still in this best of breed world. There are more than 300 different EMR systems out there that you can buy, and most of them will disappear over time. But right now you're grappling. You said more than 100 of different systems you're trying to integrate. I mean, this is just crazy, right? It's amazing how difficult this is.
And it's much more difficult to deal with healthcare data than it is financial data, right? Financial
Right.
data is
It's much more complex.
institution, account, and dollar amount, as opposed to you want to know what disease state there are, you want to know vitals, you want to know what time, what day it would happen. So you need a lot more information in order to provide accurate care.
So some of this probably will resolve itself as there's more standardization. But in the meantime, there's a lot of opportunity for better interoperability systems that translate data, interpret data, map data, clean up data.
I think it's very typical in an emerging technology kind of sector to see multiple different standards compete until something becomes, to your point about multiple EMR systems. And so I think that's kind of typical. I think fundamentally it's a technology problem, right? That you can have all this information. There's obviously some regulatory compliance issues as well, HIPAA compliance in particular, that makes this data sensitive and puts some additional constraints in how portable and how open it can be. But I think fundamentally, getting these systems to talk to each other is an IT problem. The interesting thing is, the consumerization of healthcare actually is kind of an orthogonal solution to this problem, right? In a way, because as I mentioned earlier, things like this whole quantified self movement are allowing consumers, both the individual as well as consumers en masse, to upload their health data, right? Whether it's measured or whether that they've inputted from their medical history or charts into the cloud. And that's leading to sort of all sorts of interesting scenarios where now, you can look at that data as a third party, as a commercial entity, or as a medical entity, and figure out interesting patterns derived from it. And so that's another way to circumvent the fact that yes, the data lives within all these different silos within the traditional hospital IT infrastructure, but yet, this consumerization of healthcare is allowing the data to then be made available in more of a democratized fashion, and could be another way for innovative companies to tap into all the types of things that you can do it, whether it's, as Royce mentioned, predictive analytics, or whether it's kind of, as you mentioned, then kind of inferences about national trends versus regional trends. I think all of these things should be possible increasingly over time as both of these trends get traction.
And the VA has been through some of these dilemmas because we have so much of a mature system. So we went through the situation where the cardiology department at, say, Palo Alto wanted a wonderful piece of software that didn't communicate with either the medical record or any other VA. And so, and other departments did the same. And those have now gone away largely. And so those vendors that wish to do business with the VA, like for example Stentor, the radiology giant Stentor, based here in San Francisco, works for many different healthcare organizations. And when we want to access a radiograph, we go within the computerized patient record, not to a website, but there's a link. To us, it's transparent. It's a link within the computerized patient record. Those companies that wanted to sell cameras to the Veterans Administration needed to have an interface to the computerized patient record, a DICOM interface that spoke the same language and was vetted by the VA's IT system. So when you're big enough, or when you're trying to sell to a large number of clients that you want to have something that really is interoperative, then having these interfaces that can communicate to the organization and having the organization require it as a condition of getting a sale is how this was solved within our organization. And our image database, for example, again, is a separate server, but to us it's transparent. It's part of the computerized patient record, and we can have any one of 65 different file formats that are part of this data image database, and we can see that on the desktop. And as far as other VAs, we are, although our server is located in Northern California, we're able to access information from a website, again, within the computerized patient record that tells us where the patient has been. Today I looked something up from a patient who came from Oregon who I'd never seen before. And we were able to see all his notes from Oregon. Not in the same format, but very useful to be able to know what was done for them. So I think that
isn't the VA the exception, though, in the grand scheme of things, the VA is the exception.
though it came to this, by hard lessons.
Right.
When it's one thing to have a perfect solution that a clinician wants, and then it's another for an administrator who signs the bill saying this does not work for everybody. The people in San Francisco can't see your angiogram. What good is that? The people elsewhere, if the person is having their remote image done and the camera does not speak to the remote site, then what's the point of taking an image that can't be seen? So it's come to this with hard lessons, but again, it should be a lesson for the way this probably will shake out.
Well, I think that's where all the organizations are going towards.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the time and effort to get there.
Right.
I'm sure every time Camino is purchasing technology, the idea is it's going to integrate into my EMR.
Right.
Now the problem is it's going to take 3 months, unlikely, 6 to 9 to a year for that to actually happen if you brought in a new RIS system or a new laboratory information system. Because of the intricacies of the systems, not necessarily, while there are standards for interoperability within healthcare, HL7 and other ways, standards, at least in healthcare, have always been, there are standards and the rules and guidelines were meant to be broken, at least for healthcare, it seemed like. EDI standards were a little bit more, this is how you're going to do an EDI transaction. You know, this field is always going to be used this way. Healthcare has been a little bit more loose in those standards. And so it's been challenging, even though you have a DICOM interface, to have 2 or 3 different DICOM interfaces going into the same EMR. And that's a challenge that all the organizations, all those larger health systems are going through. And some of them may have competing products, and then they have to go through that wonderful exercise of, okay, do I go to 1? Do I go to 2? Do I keep them all? Okay, if I want to reduce my costs, I want to go down to 1 system. So therefore, I'm taking resources that could look at integrating more systems to now trying to do consolidation and standardization. And that's been a major challenge I see in healthcare. It's just, at least for IT, there's too much work almost.
So with all the different proliferation of systems, how are you providing data portability? I know HHS is coming out with the Blue Button standard for...
We've started that.
Yeah.
Right. In the VA's patient portal, HealthyVet, the so-called Blue Button, is now gone through a pilot program and is being implemented where patients can see their own medical record. And in the future, we'll be able to contribute to it.
And
right.
Most organizations, patient portals are required as part of the meaningful use legislation. The problem is that every single organization has their own patient portal. And they're going to decide what information they're going to publish out there, and none of the portals are necessarily going to interact. So if you see El Camino for the hospital, but you happen to go to a Palo Alto Medical Foundation provider for your ambulatory record, for your ambulatory visit, they're not necessarily going to talk. And then you actually happen to have veterans benefits and go over there, you now have 3 patient portals to look at.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I think Kaiser has done a
Absolutely.
fairly good job. I mean, after VA, the one that I would cite would be Kaiser. And I think they got on the bandwagon much earlier than the rest of the hospitals in trying to strike the right balance between cost containment and sustenance of quality, and basically readdressing the role of a physician, as to how far the physician and how many hours they can and what all they're doing. So I think they have kind of come at it from a solution focused, looking at how do you balance it. So I think of all the systems that I can think of, after VA is the Kaiser that has done a fairly good job.
Interesting. I mean, there are a number of communication standards. Blue Button is for patient-facing, primarily CCD, and others are internally in the hospital. Part of the problem is also that hospitals, it's a standardization. I think we really need more standardization of workflows, for example. It's not just of technology, it's of workflows and the like. As people say, you've seen Epic. Epic is one of the big things. You've seen one Epic implementation. You've seen one Epic implementation. Kaiser spent $1 billion customizing Epic to their hospitals. And it looks different from the way El Camino would be using all of the VA uses it, right? So even when they buy the same EMR, you can't rely, when you now try to deliver an analytics software on top of it, that it's built in a particular way and will definitely deliver that data and so on, and that you've been relying on. And it can be a real nightmare.
But I think the interesting thing about Kaiser is, talking about workflow, a lot of it is driven by how the system is working from a physician's contribution perspective. So as opposed to in some systems, a physician is monitoring the patient from beginning to end. But in the case of Kaiser, it's almost like a unionized sharing of how you're looking at a patient. So I think it becomes easier to have a system where you have the information available, where anybody can just dip in, because from a mindset perspective, you have a 9 to 5. And that is what you're focusing on. So I think it's interesting. It's the interplay of how the system changes are taking place.
Well, healthcare is going to be a team sport.
Right.
It hasn't been. It's those people that really have been their own individuals are really going to go away.
Precisely. So that shift is also taking place. The whole Norman Rockwell kind of a physician is kind of taking
Has
the
already
shift.
gone. Has already
right,
gone.
and then you're seeing this whole.
But it will be even greater because people will depend on specialists who are distant. Because
Right.
not every healthcare system can afford to have the best neurosurgeon or the best whatever. And so having this consultation, having remote consultation and improved access. Basically the take-home message is, to me, is any application, any product that improves patient access to their doctor and improves access within the healthcare system to other specialists is going to succeed. And but a lot of that is also retraining the doctor.
It's a mindset. That's what
the technology is
yes.
actually fairly straightforward for
Right.
video conferencing and teleconsultation.
So, but Kaiser is very unique to us, like VA is, because it is a fully integrated,
Right.
single accountable
Exactly.
organization, because
Right.
it both is the payer, the provider, and the hospitals all in one. So they have the vested interest in when they spend that $1 billion or $1 billion plus in making sure it was a system that can be coordinated across all that entire continuum. So getting the data to the right people, whether they're in the hospital or in the ambulatory record, and then putting in the appropriate rules for notification so that if you're overdue for a mammogram and you happen to be going to the pharmacy, it alerts the pharmacist, hey, you're overdue, we can go, because we're all in one system, let's go schedule your mammogram.
You cannot get away from your colonoscopy.
Right, you think.
That's the take-home message.
And then they can change the rules, right? I mean, the mammogram used to say every year. If they decide as an organization that the evidence now says it should be every 2 years or every 3 years or every 5 years, they can make that system change relatively simple, though across multiple solutions. And that now goes, as you said, a standard across all of Kaiser, as opposed to each of these other organizations where they have to adjust that, and then they have payers and or other entities saying, well, our care plan is this for hypertension. Our care plan for this is different than perhaps Blue Cross and Medicare. They may say, we want you to do this. So as a provider, you have to do different things, as opposed to Kaiser says, we got one care plan, one way to care for patients, no matter what they're.
Yeah, I mean, I think that broadly is a very important point, actually, which is fundamentally, yes, to answer your question, there are technology aspects and a lot of solutions. I'm sure SAP has a dozen solutions around how this data could be integrated, and there's ways to do it. It comes down to, I think, business incentives, right? And I think you make an excellent point, Royce, about the fact that isn't it funny that these entities that are unified payer providers are the ones that actually are at the forefront of some of this innovation. And it's kind of like, I think as silly as it sounds, if a startup goes to a hospital and says, I have a technique where you can get a patient out, you can reduce the amount of duration of a hospital stay by 50%. The hospital should say yes, rationally and logically. Chances are they'll say no if someone else is paying for it and there's a business model disincentive to do it.
That's right.
So I think it does come down to incentives, and I think that could be and to some extent scale. To be fair, I mean I think individual practices are on the decline now, but you see this fragmentation of systems, particularly in cost-sensitive subscale practices where they go with what's expedient, not necessarily what's going to scale or largely help the patient in the long run. All of this, by the way, just to wrap that up, is again goes to this broader point around, I think, for the entrepreneurs in the room, for tremendous room for innovation. And I think it points to two things. I'm always baffled. I go to get my car serviced, and the guy pulls up the entire record on the computer and knows exactly when the tire was changed and when everything was done, by who, regardless of where I've gotten it done. And yet I go to see a doctor, and they have to sort of ask me. I still have to fill out the same form. What are your allergies, right?
I mean, being a doctor is easy. There's only 2 models, but being a car mechanic, that takes some talent.
But I do have a level of appreciation and respect for physicians that's unparalleled, because I am always pleasantly surprised by a few simple questions, and they figure out what not to prescribe and what to prescribe, and I'm like, wow, that it takes a lot of insight and experience to get to that conclusion quickly without a whole printout in front of you.
But I think what I'd like to add is that, especially from an entrepreneur's perspective, think we need to be mindful of the fact that there are socio-political economic forces at play. So one obviously is the alignment of interest. And in the case of Kaiser, you're absolutely right. The cost containment can take place because all the systems are saying the same thing, right? And unless you have that, no matter how many data you have and how many databases you have and how many systems you have, unless you have a fundamental alignment of interest, the system is not going to work because somebody is going to find a way for it to not work. And if everybody is paid for the system to work, then it is automatically has a higher likelihood for it to happen. The second facet is that since every physician is almost mandated now to have information codified, and so you need to have a system in place to work with, that gets to be expensive. And so obviously there's a shift towards you don't have that many individual physicians, private physicians functioning. But also I think there's a third facet that is at play, and that is that this whole work-life balance is taking place. And the physicians today do not, at least the new generation of physicians today, do not necessarily want to be lead the kind of life that the physicians in the other generation had spent their time doing, and basically had themselves were not that healthy because they didn't have the time to take care of themselves. So I think from an entrepreneur standpoint, it is critical to understand all the different forces that are at play, and that is shifting. And I think that's why I think Kaiser was caught in the right inflection point where you had all of these things coming together that allowed them to have the kind of system that they have going forward.
Okay, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about providing healthcare and patient access to their records and physicians' access to patient records. But let's talk a little bit about the other side, which may be of interest to some people at the VCtaskforce here. That how about investments? When you're thinking about innovation and investing, what's driving some of these decisions?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off on that. I'll start by saying that, as I alluded to earlier, one of the things for startups to think about in this is your business plan could be eminently rational, eminently logical, and eminently sensible from a patient perspective, but you've got to make sure it works for all the stakeholders within the value chain you're selling to. And so, typically I'm looking for companies that, are capital efficient, that have a disruptive technology or model, and that have a relatively quick go-to-market strategy so that the proof points come sooner rather than later. And there's got to be indications of market acceptance from the key constituencies in that healthcare value chain, whether it's the payer, the provider, or the hospital, as well as the patient. So, in particular, I'd highlight a couple of themes that I think are pretty interesting to me, and I think that have resonance within kind of the venture capital landscape today. So one is kind of just helping businesses and consumers make more informed health choices, which I think, Len, you kind of spoke to, and Nandini, you spoke to as well. There's a lot, everything from the quantified self to comparison shopping for healthcare. I think all of those things are relatively straightforward and logical extensions of current kind of models out there, and I think there's room to play for startups. Second, I think as an investor, I always think about how do you cater to the mega trends, right? So what are the mega trends? Well, two of the biggest ones are obesity and aging, right? I saw a billboard on 101 the other day by an insurance company saying 1 out of 3 babies born today will live to be more than 100 years old, which actually took me a few minutes to kind of absorb that. But it's pretty mind-boggling if you think about it.
Did they say how many of them will be obese?
2 out of 3.
Yeah, 2.
2 out of 3 maybe, right?
The other two. That's
Right.
I think you have to go out of a 9 out of 10 statistic for that, unfortunately, the way we're headed, right? So I think maybe these are more private equity than venture, but businesses such as I think that can play into these mega trends, I think are interesting, right? Whether it's assisted living facilities to cater to more aging demographics, or even if you look at the FDA's recent decisions around drugs such as Vivus's drug or Arena Pharmaceuticals drugs, these are drugs that a few years ago you would have kind of really doubted that the FDA would approve because of the side effect profile, and yet they have been approved with the risk labeling and all that in place, because I think fundamentally the regulatory bodies are realizing that this is such a strong epidemic, such a major epidemic, The statistics are just unbelievable. Depending on every number I read, with the progression of time becomes more and more shocking in terms of the incidence and obesity and all the, obviously the concomitant health issues associated with that. That I think it's going to be something that regulatory environment will encourage, and to the extent entrepreneurs can play into that, I think it will be incredibly lucrative. Thirdly, I'd highlight the notion of digitizing parts of the doctor-patient relationship. And I pick my words carefully because, quite frankly, people have been talking about telemedicine for a long time, right? And I remember, right? Yeah. I remember back when I was at MIT, people would say, "Well, all this inflated physician salaries in the U.S. they're a thing of the past, and get in front of a computer, and there'll be some surgeon in the Philippines who's going to diagnose you and treat you." I don't think we're going to get there ever because of a number of issues. So I think that mainstream, adoption to that extent. For one, I think there's liability issues, there's insurance company acceptance, and a whole bunch of issues. But I do think some of the low-hanging fruit will be addressed, and I think things like, if I have a minor ailment, maybe I can get a relatively simple diagnosis using e-health or telemedicine. If I have a follow-up question to my doctor, right, I should be able to email them, and versus having to set up another appointment. It's pretty basic stuff, but I feel like, at Kaiser, like you mentioned,
Right.
It's pretty good at this, and it's pretty efficient for them, right? It kind of reflects the fact that they do care about the payer side of the equation too. And then finally, an area that I've started to look into a little bit that's fairly new is this whole notion of DNA testing and personal genomics. So there are companies like 23andMe that are kind of doing partial gene sequencing today on a path towards whole gene sequencing with the goal that they can give you as a user or as a consumer an indication of inherited traits, genealogy, and possible congenital risk factors. And there's a lot of issues with that around privacy and how that data is shared and exposed. But I think if you think about it, that technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper exponentially, and I think there's going to be some pretty big disruption there. And quite frankly, I think for most consumers, there's a desire to know and desire to be aware of their medical condition. And from a provider perspective, I think there could be benefits in terms of advanced warning signals of possible risk factors. So that's a fourth area that I'd highlight, although I think it's a bit further out than the other three.
Marcus?
Yeah, Marcus.
Well, William Gibson said the future is already here. It's unevenly distributed. So one way to look also at this is you look at the thought leaders and the early adopters like a Kaiser and the VA and so on, that also had, of course, the resources, right? So they have the money to spend on this. What are all the other hospitals doing out there that are just now putting EMRs in there, that just now putting nurse communication systems in, and so on? I think there's a lot of innovation that can be applied, but just looking what these hospitals have learned, what worked, what didn't work, and make it happen for the other hospitals. So if you take, for example, this example that you had on engaging the consumer, engaging the patient at the right time with the right message, right? So the person is at the pharmacist, you somehow catch them right there, and you know something about that patient. They haven't had a mammogram in a certain time. Maybe something about the medical history. You can deliver a personalized message. They're much more likely to respond to that than if you send them a letter by mail once a year reminding them that, by the way, once they turn, you've forgotten that by the time later, right? So this is a very integrated system. You can make that happen. How are all the other hospitals going to do this? And how are you going to catch the consumer with personalized messages at the right time? And obviously there are with mobile apps, with better connections, with tapping into some of the data that's available. You can make a lot happen. And so I think there's opportunity for innovation there. Another important aspect is we often want, of course, very powerful, insightful systems, so analytics. But for many people, especially the consumer, just getting something that's understandable is already a huge progress. One company I like a lot is Simply. If you take them as an example, Simply, so you all know you get the EOB, the explanation of benefits, and it's a claim statement. It's impossible to read, and you have no idea why you're paying.
This is not a bill.
Yeah, exactly. And what does it mean? And how much did you pay? And you get yet another one. And Simply sucks the data from all the insurance companies, including dental and so on, together, and then shows you in nice visual ways. Not doing a lot of analytics, mostly visualization, information visualization. How much you're paying for what, where you maybe have an opportunity to save a little bit, and so on, right? So I think it's systems like these that pull the data together for you. You could go to the website yourself and get it. It's just a huge pain, right? And then just visualize it nicely. There's a lot of opportunity there too.
Marcus, since you see a broad range of companies other than the VA and Kaiser, I'd be curious to see what sorts of trends and innovations you're seeing across the rest of the unwashed masses.
Well, I talked about some of those earlier, and I think many of those that you heard, whether it's telehealth or it's more sharing of data, it's more analytics. So I would primarily repeat many. I think workflow automation is maybe one we haven't really talked about yet. We heard it sort of underneath. It turns out nurses spend more than half their time with documentation and coordination of their work, right? So just getting at data about a patient and then entering data when they took some measurements and so on, and then coordinating with other nurses. And it's amazing how archaic some of these technologies are. They use their personal cell phones often to call and, are you ready yet? And, I need help for lifting the patient, turning the patient's washroom, and all that stuff. And there's a lot of different people involved. That too is, some hospitals have seen we're involved in some of that, is you can help and you can automate some of that in the background, this coordination with scheduling systems and the like.
Are you seeing a wide adoption of biomonitoring and to assist nurses in that sort of workflow? Or, we've seen some of these new technologies where there's the biomonitoring of the basic heartbeat and basic blood pressure, et cetera, oxygenation. Are you seeing adoption of those sorts of technologies to help the nurses with their workflow?
I'm actually don't know that much about this. I think yes, in the hospital it's relatively easy. Where we talked about this earlier, in the home is a huge potential.
Huge.
But harder, right? Because
right.
now you have the 80-year-old that may mess things up, and
right.
and so these systems need to get a lot easier. There's a lot of potential in camera technology, in contactless diagnosis. Many of these vital signs can be measured without ever touching the person. There are increasing out of tricorder to start, and there are lots of teams worldwide working on sort of the tricorder kind of system from Star Trek. And more and more, Alcor with the heart monitor that you can measure at home, so the equivalent of an EKG. There are home tests we talked earlier about measuring
Coagulation.
Yeah,
status.
that things that took a big machine in the past, now you can have a disposable chip and do measurements. So that's coming and will make a huge difference.
Is here. That's really here. I want to tell you about a program that the
I'll give you
VA
the
has been done. Yeah, that's right. 90,000 people in the VA are now under a program called Care Coordination. That means they have a device in their home which talks to a nurse. About 150 patients per nurse are managed in this way. And it's a recognition of the fact that by the time you show up in your emergency room with your chest pain, by the time you show up with your chronic care, it's the 9th inning and you have 2 strikes out. So these things were predictable days, weeks, and months in advance. And so by getting the information, by getting daily blood pressures, daily sugars, daily weights, by asking the patient a series of 20 questions depending on their disease condition, did you gain weight? Did you take your pills? Have you gained weight? Are you short of breath? And having those answers go in an automated way to a nurse practitioner and be coded on a website, and to have coagulation studies and all these things transmitted daily. This is how the VA and other organizations, Kaiser has a very small program, but by and large, I really believe this is the future, because they've done health economic studies showing that there's tremendous savings to be had. And that's why they've invested in telehealth and said that 15% of encounters within 2 years will be through one of these modalities, either home telehealth, clinical video telehealth, or store and forward telehealth. And so that's what's being done now.
And I think more the hospitals are getting incentivized to ensure that the patient does not return and the patient stays at home, and that they have a circle of caregivers around them, whether they are hired or family. The more we will be having, this trend is going to become even more pronounced.
I mean, we were working on some of these things, and the challenges are compliance, particularly on an advanced 80-year-old. Are they really going to be able to enter in that information and
That's
gain
why
that
the
information?
caregiver would be very important, right?
Right. So, being able to manage it with a nurse with 150 makes it more doable. What we found is actually those nurses had to actually go out to the site to take a look at gathering that information, getting more from them, and really engaging not just that individual but their family.
Mhm.
So that
Exactly.
I think is one of the things that, in particular, with privacy and so forth, that may be an opportunity for organizations, as yourself, is how to help family members care for their elderly relatives.
Len, how did you get compliance?
Well, there's the government, Tell them you must do this. Patients like this. You have to find out what's in it for the patient. So
Right.
for our patients, they're in remote rural areas. And so for them, it's a lifeline, knowing that somebody is looking at their data. Also, there is a home care, primary care visiting nurse system, so that when the nurse practitioner sees those data, she will call the patient and, if necessary, send somebody out there. So for them, it was a lifeline. So I think that for most of these products, you have to say, who are you appealing to? Are you appealing to the payer? Are you appealing to the healthcare team? Are you appealing to the provider, or a combination? And that's, you have to ask who is the incentive for this product. Mm.
You could ask questions. We're going to open up for questions in
Sorry, I was
5 minutes or so.
disrupted.
Others already asked, so go ahead.
Yeah.
Charlie,
I was just
how come
curious.
you're not surprised?
One of these areas you sort of touched on, I'm sure there'll be big discussion points at HIMSS conference next week. One is the HIE, and I know that Cerner and HBO and McKesson and SureScripts, I think, are announcing some big venture that they're doing in that regard. And also, you haven't touched upon kind of the high-tech HIPAA security issues around this, which, we're trying to share all this information among us and at the same time guarantee the patient, a very high level of security over their information. And so I was just curious as to any of your thoughts about investments in those areas.
I mean, security-wise, much of that regulation hasn't really been determined, right? And it's still up for debate, some of the stuff of what is and what isn't. And much of it's going to be a challenge eventually by the legal system. What is legal, what's not? What do we as providers actually need to share with each other so we can provide you actual care? It's much easier within Kaiser because you're a Kaiser patient there, but across organizations, how do we do that? And that's also impacting the providers in their accepting of this consumer data, because if they start accepting some of this consumer data, they're concerned about their liability. What happens if they miss the low blood pressure? What happens if they miss information that's in there? Or what happens if that information is inaccurate and they act upon it? So I think HIPAA and security and patient privacy are definitely key, and they're going to make a major role in what's going to happen in the future. I just don't think that it's determined yet just how far or how short it is. I mean, we've had opt-in, opt-out. All those things have been tossed around, and personally I think it's going to take probably the central government to say this is what it's going to be, because it's a lawyer fest until it.
Yeah, I think a critical mass has to be reached, enough of these changes having taken place for that to get taken care of.
Well, new HIPAA regulations came out just last week or so, right? Or just recently, the updated HIPAA regulations. I don't know that much about them. It's just a huge pain. It's a huge pain for innovation,
Yeah.
right? Because
But
there's so many things you cannot do that
Right.
I think could really deliver benefits. It's a lot of learning you have to do. At Park, we had one project that is doing something in the state of California, and all of Park needed to get new passwords and some new procedures in order to be HIPAA compliant. because we're all in the same building.
But I have a feeling just like FDA has to assess the risk-benefit profile. And I think, Gaurav, as you were saying earlier, that some of the drugs we would have thought would not have been approved because of their side effects are being because just about what are the risk-benefit profile. I think in the case of HIPAA also, I think some of those questions will get raised. How are we benefiting and what are the risks? And how do we strike the right balance?
But then who makes that decision?
Well, that's exactly right. Exactly.
And I'd say, as an entrepreneur, right, it's the kind of VCs hate to fund companies that are contingent upon regulatory approval or action for success in general. So I think one way around this is, there's restrictions on, on these entities and these providers sharing data, but as a consumer, you have some latitude into how much of your data you want to expose. And, I think kind of, this whole, again, we're measuring, you have the capacity today in your smartphone to measure a lot of things about you, right? There are smartphones, in the future, Apple's coming out with an iWatch, right? There's these things out there that as a consumer, you can expose this data if you wanted to. And by exposing this data, you could potentially try to take steps towards, mitigating some adverse health consequences. And I think you made a great point, Len. Actually, I'm really happy to hear about this corrective care program. Corrective care is that program, which is really amazing. I mean, how often does this happen? That by the time people show up to the ER, you characterize it really well. Second strike of the ninth inning. Games the odds are so stacked against you. By the time you've had an intermittent chest pain for 7 days, and you've been having it continuously for the last 45 minutes. Well, good luck. Unfortunately. So I'd say, so as a consumer, I think there's more empowerment today than there has been before. And I think one way entrepreneurs and startups can get into this market is by going after the consumer market and allowing the consumers to federate the data to the extent that they can do so in a reasonably secure and private way. Right? If you look at Mint.com, right, which was a big exit a few years ago, they did this for financial data, right? And you could get some cool analytics and insights from your data, and you could share it with other people, and in a pseudo-anonymized fashion. And then credit card companies and mortgage companies could kind of look at your financial profile, give you preferential treatment based upon what you were exposing. And it's not unthinkable to think that this will eventually become another mechanism for consumers to take a more hands-on approach towards their own well-being.
And when you were talking earlier as to what the VCs are looking to invest in, let's not forget the whole exit profile.
Right.
I mean, yes, the VCs are shy about investing with regulatory bodies involved, but they're even more shy to invest if they don't see an exit.
That's right.
So I think that's the other facet that we have to keep in mind.
Right.
Did we answer both of your questions?
The first one was HIEs.
Well, I was really interested in whether you saw it. It seems to me a lot of healthcare organizations are not using mobile platforms, for example, even though they really want to, because the platform itself is not secure. And so it seems to me there's opportunity for technology or investable ideas to improve that. That was one of my questions.
There are mobile vendors that claim HIPAA compliance for the texting application, for example, or secure message exchange of some sort and so on. So, and you can download EMRs. I mean, you can. I think Kaiser's you can probably access through your iPhone or so.
Sorry, so I'm not hearing a lot of interest, a lot of opportunity for investment at the end of the day in those areas. Is that what I'm hearing?
You mentioned a couple of different areas. I just want to make sure I understand what area you're referring to, Steve. Maybe you can rephrase that a little bit.
No, we sort of got off on the second, the security piece, but obviously if somebody came up with technologies that could make that information, particularly on mobile devices, more secure but accessible at the same time,
That would be
may be a
attractive.
big opportunity for investment. I hadn't heard that.
Well, I think it comes down to, I think somebody, I think Len, you made the point that it depends on, who's the value, who are you providing value to in this, and I think is a value pretty clear. So I think it depends, in theory, right, I mean, what you're saying sounds appealing. The question would be, I think I'd have to get a bit more detail on who you're targeting this towards, right? If it's targeted towards a provider, then I think one would have to ask the question that relative to the current state of affairs, right, what incremental benefit versus cost? I think these are cost-benefit trade-offs ultimately.
I think security is not the issue. If you look at why Google Health failed and while Microsoft Health World is not used very much, it's not because people feel it's unsecure. It's because they have to populate by hand their records, and I think that was one big reason. And there isn't just a lot of incentive for most. If you can do this automatically, Mint connects to your bank account and downloads it automatically. Simply, I mentioned earlier, does that too. If you can automatically populate your record and use it, then there is much more interest, I'm convinced, than the way they did it, where you had by hand, you had to connect things together, and it was just really cumbersome.
I'm sorry, I don't want to finish tonight.
If I could just throw my 2 cents in, I think that security and mobility are issues that also expand beyond just like healthcare, what we've talked about. So perhaps the answers may come from just the larger, solving those larger problems. There was a question in the back.
Yeah, I have a question about making it easier for the consumers. Like insurance companies normally, for example, don't fund the continuous glucose monitor, right? They push back. So do you ever see what would be needed for insurance companies to make it easy for consumers to do more of the self-monitoring, to get the devices to do self-monitoring?
So the question was what would make it easier, what would make insurance companies adopt more, proactive self-monitoring at home? Like what, this is I just started talking, now I have more to say. Right, so we talked a little bit about, if you have some business and you can get someone discharged faster, where's the incentive behind that? Because you're getting paid to keep them in the hospital. So where's the incentive, the financial incentive to do prevention? And that's something that I was trying to deal with tuberculosis treatment like 20 years ago, is that there were actually governments that they talk about the benefit of you would get more money if you let the person get sick and then hospitalize them than you would by preventing the disease. So how can we shift that? Is that it may not necessarily be a technology answer.
I think it's all about pain. I think let's face it, that the
physical pain or financial pain?
I think the financial. It's a financial pain.
Well, they could lead to each other.
They could lead to each other. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, this metamorphosis that we are having in this soul searching that is going through the healthcare industry is all because of financial pain. It's not because, and I'm sorry to say, not because of the genuine desire to see a patient be in prime health. So I think that's why I think this proactive focus and alignment of interest, where monies get saved, sustainability gets enhanced because of proactive rather than prevention, rather than the other way around, is that the only way I think is going to change.
Could we someday see incentives, financial incentives for consumers?
Yes.
The consumers is one thing, but the 2 models, of course, are accountable care organizations and managed care organizations, right? And if you have a patient in those models, they sign up for a certain cost, and it's very much in a certain payment. It's very much in their interest to keep people healthy and to monitor them after they come, they've been discharged and so on. Because anything that goes above what it's supposed to cost, they have to eat themselves. And so they're sort of trying to build an integrated system by having payers and providers work together.
Do you think it's working?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But Matt, I'd say, look, as a venture capitalist, I always look at these things through the prism of economic incentive alignment. And I think there are companies out there that are going to corporations today and saying, if you can incentivize your employees to lead more healthy lives, and we can somehow measure compliance with that, whatever fitness or diet regimen, that we recommend, we will give you a break on your healthcare premium. That's out there today, right? And companies are doing that. They're creating employee health and wellness portals where if you work out for a certain amount of hours per week, or if you report kind of what a healthy lifestyle you're leading, you either get you get kind of financially compensated for that, or you get financially punished by having to pay a portion of your premium if you're not complying with that. So I think fundamentally insurance companies in particular are very, very coin-operated entities, right? I mean, they are for-profit institutions in every sense of the word, and I think they need, if you can show them that cost-benefit analysis, and I think to the specific question that was asked, whether it's continuous glucose monitoring or something else, I think it just comes down to, as an insurance company, does the expense outlay in providing this benefit exceed, what I would have otherwise incurred in curing sort of something that, condition that came out of this, right? So I think sometimes it's hard to demonstrate. Sometimes the interrelationships between things are pretty complex. But I think that movement is happening because, quite frankly, healthcare costs are very too high. The rate of healthcare cost increase is unsustainable. And the amount of healthcare inefficiency, despite the amount of healthcare spend, is staggering.
And money talks, and I think there are, I don't know if you have seen this movie about the healthcare fire escape. I don't know if you have seen that, but in any case, what they focus on some of the companies where the CEOs of the companies have incentivized their employees very clearly by saying that if you do X, Y, Z, you get $5,000, $7,000, $10,000 back, and that is all that is helping dramatically. So I think at the end of the day, it's all fiscal pain. I mean, not the physical pain, and I think that's what's going to drive it. And I think corporations will themselves will have to take this on themselves.
There are some of the larger organizations have become self-funded insurance companies. They're paying for the healthcare. They're taking accountability, and therefore they're circumventing some of the issues that you're raising about insurers paying for this or that. They recognize that having a healthy workforce that's going to work, that's happy and healthy, is a good workforce, right? One that doesn't get sick, that doesn't call in, that doesn't have issues with cancer or just even the common cold or flu, and keeping them healthy is important. So therefore they would probably go and look at, glucose monitoring for a diabetic, yeah, let's do that. Let's put that as part of our program.
Yes.
I just want to offer a comment that there are two books that if anyone's interested, if you read, they touch on almost every topic that you've discussed here. There's The Innovator's Prescription and then The Creative Destruction of Medicine. And those two books are exceptional. Every single topic that you've talked about here has been, very thoroughly analyzed. They're both relatively recent.
Clayton Christensen and Eric Topol. And Eric Topol is great in general because he talks a lot about mobile and digital health.
Right. Yeah.
There's also, I think, an excellent, I haven't read it fully actually, but an excellent Time magazine article that just came out. I think talking about many of these problems, worth reading.
Yes.
So to shift gears slightly, we have the CARE Act that's coming up. We haven't really talked about it much. What opportunities and what changes do you see coming down the pipeline?
The world will look like Kaiser and the VA. I do think. There are organizations that want to compete will have to do so on the basis of a preventative model of health instead of a reactive model of health. You'll be rewarded you'll have a fixed amount of funds that you're paid per patient, and if you exceed it, you'll have to eat it, and doctors will be asked to take on more risk. Any tools, any technological tools that help them assess risk, because doctors are not accustomed to dealing with those kinds of issues. Those kinds of tools will be big sellers, I think. And it's going to be a different model. So I think to see the future, you just have to look at the present, look at organizations that treat millions of patients, and realize that many large hospital systems will have to become more like that in order to survive.
We shared responsibility.
It will be shared
incentives.
And shared with the consumer. I think, as I understand it, that's a big difference to HMOs in the 90s. Right? They were all about payers dictating to the hospitals, the providers, what to do and what not to do, and consumers were just oblivious to that; just had to live with it. But now consumers, as was said earlier, they have to pay part of it. They are expected to be good shoppers, and payers are helping them with that. I had this really interesting experience recently. I needed an MRI, and when I came back from the doctor, before I came home, I had a message from Aetna on my answering machine saying, the MRI has been improved, by the way, we would like to help you find a good place to do it. And I'm not going to name names, but the difference was fivefold, between some of the bigger hospitals here, where it's in the $3,000 plus, or for about $400. I can get it in one. An MRI is not
Right.
something that unusual anymore. And so once you learn about this, and we become better shoppers, and any tools that can help with that. They had it actually on their website, but the website was terrible to use. And so anything that can help consumers become better about their health and about choices will make a difference.
Yeah, it's almost the intermediaries in health provide a disincentive for actually learning about that information.
Right.
Right.
So then it brings up the question: how do you provide that information in an open and non-obfuscated way that is transparent to all parties?
That they can understand.
Yeah. And how would you see that happening, or how do you see that happening?
I think it's tough. I think, look, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about isn't rocket science, right? It kind of makes a lot of sense.
Common sense, yeah.
It's going to save money, it's going to increase efficiency, it's going to enhance transparency. All of those are good things. But I think fundamentally, it's kind of like, selling into healthcare is probably second only in complexity to selling into cable companies, I think. If you're trying to sell into a cable company, it's not always, you don't always get kind of the cost-benefit analysis you'd expect, right? And I think, as an entrepreneur or someone building a company in this space, I think it's important to get, have a go-to-market approach and a business model that actually works for the key people that you're relying upon to make that successful. I think, you've got to kind of, I think a lot of folks have alluded to this on the panel, but it's not always in your interest as a healthcare provider to expose your costs or your prices, right? Because the way coding happens and the way billing happens, it is beyond complex, right?